Now for today's program. Today's Zoominar is part of the Wide River Project, an initiative that takes a deep dive and fresh look into the art, history, and issues that both unite and divide the Black and Jewish communities. We are pleased to welcome back Dr. Lillie Johnson Edwards, Professor Emerita of History and African American Studies at Drew University, where she was founding director of Pan-African Studies and received awards for excellent and distinguished teaching. She is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Oberlin College and received her doctorate in history from the University of Chicago. As a public intellectual, Dr. Edwards has lectured and consulted for libraries, corporations, historical societies, and museums, including the Garden State Coalition of Schools, the New Jersey Council for Social Studies, the Capitol Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C., Apple Inc., the National Park Service, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Ford Foundation. Dr. Edwards is currently the vice chair of the Oberlin College and Conservatory Board of Trustees and was appointed to the Board of Ordained Ministries by the Bishop of the New Jersey Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church. She is a life member and former national director of the Association of Black Women Historians and is a life member of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, which presented her with the Mary McLeod Bethune Award. Appointed by Governor Phil Murphy and serving as chair of New Jersey's Amistad Commission since July 2022, Dr. Edwards is guiding the commission's strategic initiatives that will support New Jersey educators as they infuse African Americans into the K-12 curriculum. Joining Dr. Edwards today is Nadine Epstein. Nadine is an award-winning journalist and author. She has been the editor-in-chief and CEO of Moment Magazine since 2004 and is the founder and executive director of the Center for Creative Change. Nadine's most recent book is RBG's Brave and Brilliant Women, 33 Jewish Women to Inspire Everyone, which she wrote in collaboration with the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Please welcome Dr. Lillie Edwards and Nadine Epstein.
I just want to tell everyone how much I love talking to Dr. Edwards. She's brilliant, and talking to her makes me wish that when I was coming up, there'd been more Black history courses, and I wish I could have taken more classes in college. And I'm really self-taught from reporting, from reading, from family, and from friends. So I always learned so much from her. I want to start just by saying, well, we picked the year 1909. I'm fascinated with years, but before we can talk about 1909, I think we just have to back up a tiny bit and talk about the era. And I'm going to start just talking maybe 1890, the sort of beginning of the progressive era. It's between maybe 1890 and then the beginning of World War I, which is around 1917 and 1918. So it's an era of reform. It's a very exciting era in the United States. And I thought, first, just tell us a little bit about that, Lillie, and then from there, we're going to talk about just generally what's happening in the country.
Certainly. And thank you so very much for having me back. And I will say, I also learn a great deal from you. And as always, I learn a great deal from the audience, from the questions they pose that I cannot answer. And it sends me back to doing more research as well. But I'm delighted to talk about this time period. Very often I said to Nadine earlier, and this is for the audience, that very often, if you think about it, this is a time period which we do not reference very often in our kind of historical memory of talking about, just in general, the history of the United States. We'll very often talk about Civil War, maybe Reconstruction, the period afterwards, and then we kind of launch into the 1920s, Roaring '20s, Depression, New Deal, et cetera. And there's almost an entire generation of American history that we leave out of the late 19th century, early 20th century. So we're really talking about a period that also is referenced as post-reconstruction, and several things are happening when we reach the 1880s, 1890s. Perhaps more important than anything else, the nation, and that means the people in economic power and political power, also cultural and social, have washed their hands of the national enterprise that was a civil war and Reconstruction. A period of time that for African Americans provided this, following the war, this very, very short window, not quite even a generation, where Black men were allowed to vote, where 20 Black men served in the House of Representatives of the United States, when 2 Black men served as senators in the United States, where Black men voted. That period ends, and it shifts in the 1880s and 90s to what historians call a focus on the business of the nation is business. You may think of this very often as the Gilded Age, the age of the robber barons, the age of the increasing monopolies over major industries, from railroad steel. You think about the Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, Carnegies, etc. We think about the creation of major banks and investment houses as well. This is also a period of increased immigration to the United States because of problems and wars and poverty as well in Europe, and most of all, people escaping political repression, which includes the Jewish population. This is also a period really of the kind of bursting forth of American industrialization that we see at the beginning of the 19th century. After the Civil War, and in part due to war industry itself and the accumulation of wealth, the United States is becoming, or has become, an urban, has developed an urban culture. Prior to the Civil War, even as...
let me just pop in here a second.
Sure.
What happens in 1890? Let's go, what's the change? Because we can't go, I don't want to go so far back because we have so much.
Well, the major changes. One is America has become urban.
Yes.
By the end of the 19th century. And what that does is to create a completely different kind of urban environment that people see as being out of control for a variety of reasons. One is poverty, one is health, one is education, and then also we have a construction of race around these new immigrants that are coming in at the end of the 19th century. It also creates, as we all know, end of the 19th century, Tammany Hall and boss politics in all of the major American cities, not just New York, but also Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, et cetera. And so there's a concern about democracy itself, as we've been talking about now. Democracy itself is being compromised by this lack of democratic processes being used. And then for African Americans, as well as other immigrants, there is a proliferation of race riots and violence. And we often think about lynchings in the South, but in fact, these race riots are occurring all over the country. And one of them I know we'll talk about in detail today is the riot in Springfield, Illinois in 1909. But there's a race riot in Atlanta in 1906. There's a race riot in South Carolina in 1898, a major one in Wilmington, North Carolina. So these killings of Black people really is occurring all over the country. And this is occurring in the 1890s.
And lynching is really at its height. Lynching is really, this is a major period of lynching.
It is, in fact, between 1889 and 1932, almost 4,000 people, 4,000 were lynched in the United States. And that's 2 or 3 people on average every week for 30 years.
So there's this whole movement that starts, and it's a movement that's about fighting the machine and fighting corruption and believing that people who are poor and immigrants and Black people, it's not their fault, it's the fault of the system. This is something that's very relevant today. So isn't this part of the progressive movement that's starting? And
Yes,
we
yes.
should talk about later about why this is so relevant today. And so suddenly you have all these reformers appearing on the scene. And I just wanted to pop back a second now. One of the major figures that we've talked about before is Booker T. Washington. He's really become the leader of the Black community, of the intellectual Black community. Tell us a little bit about Booker T. Washington and what he's doing. And I know in 1895, he gives a speech that sets off a lot of other Blacks and other people in the United States. Tell us about that.
Right. Well, one of the things we should also realize is thinking of these people who are part of the progressive era at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, they really are inheriting that earlier reform movement, for example, of abolition. Women's suffrage is still ongoing, the fight for the women's right to vote. And then also the fight for true full citizenship and freedom for Black people is still ongoing. And so they really see themselves as inheriting that mantle from an earlier generation of abolitionists. When Booker T. Washington comes on the scene, really in 1881, when Tuskegee Institute, as it is called then, and Washington is made president. And remember, this is in Macon County, Alabama, very rural. Black education is under attack. Schools are being burned. Teachers are being run out of town, whether they are Black or white teachers are being run out of town. So it is a dangerous situation, actually, to have a Black school. We shouldn't just take it for granted that it's somehow viewed as benign. And so what Washington does in 1896, so he's been, 1895, I'm sorry, so he's been president of Tuskegee for 14 years. He has the opportunity to speak at the Atlanta Exposition. We should think of this as a Southern World's Fair. And the whole point is for the South to show off it is now industrialized, it is part of the modern world. The Civil War is forgotten, and that it is part of this industrial machine. The Atlanta Exposition invites Washington to speak, which in itself, in the South, is very controversial that he is speaking to this white audience from a podium. And what he essentially says is he gives a speech that is conciliatory, makes the point of Black people will not and should not vie for political rights or voting rights. And instead, the role of Black people will be to join hand in hand, and he uses the metaphor of fingers intertwined, that Black people will remain in the South, will not leave, and will be part of this new South, and will be this dedicated, reliable, loyal workforce. And it is schools like Tuskegee that will provide the industrial education that will be appropriate for Black people. The speech is not just well received, it does, as you're saying, it really makes Booker T. Washington the most powerful Black person, not only in America, and I didn't mention this to you earlier, Nadine, but Washington and Tuskegee become the model for Europeans in Africa as well. So they're looking at Tuskegee, they're contacting Booker T. Washington. And what Washington's able to do is to turn his position into real cash for Tuskegee. And so Andrew Carnegie becomes a major donor, Rockefeller becomes a major donor, and Julius Rosenwald also becomes a major donor, not only for Tuskegee, but in building public schools all over the South, thousands of public schools all over the South for Black children. All of these benefactors and philanthropists, though, are intentionally investing in what they see as a Booker T. Washington model of education, which focuses on Black people being, at best, skilled workers, And it actually attacks the notion of Black people receiving what was called a classical, what we would call liberal arts education.
So we're talking about this because we're going to get to the NAACP very, very soon, but there's a reaction in part of the intellectual Black community, including W.E. Du Bois, and there's people, not everybody agrees with Booker T. Washington. He's taking too soft of an approach. And so before we get to the NAACP, we have to talk about one other movement here called the Niagara Movement.
Right.
So the Niagara Movement starts, and it's kind of a predecessor. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the Niagara Movement is created by W.E.B. Du Bois and others who are explicitly, vehemently anti-Washington. But we should also say, Nadine, this kind of political organizing is really going on all over the country in major cities, mainly Chicago, Boston, Washington, New York City, where Black people are organizing around a very assertive political position for essentially Black civil rights. The number one issue is lynching and the violence against Black people. Number two is disenfranchisement. Black men, the vote has been taken away from Black people. And so there are a variety of organizations that are being more assertive in taking a political position that goes directly against what Washington is promoting. The Niagara Movement, organized by W. Du Bois and others, William Monroe Trotter, who's the editor of the Baltimore African American, and other Black intellectuals and leaders, including the women who have also organized nationally, even earlier, earlier than the men, are coming together to try and create a new platform. But this is what happens to the Niagara Movement. That meets initially in Niagara Falls, it meets in Harper's Ferry, Oberlin, and also the last meeting is in Boston in 1905. Booker T. Washington is so powerful that he has people infiltrate, literally spy on all of the other Black organizations. He is so powerful that most editors of Black newspapers all over the country are very afraid of going against him. Washington has so much clout in the White House itself that Washington can arrange for people to get federal jobs. For example, Black people are working in the post office. Washington has the power to manipulate philanthropy to either go to a Black college or to be taken away. He tries to undermine even Du Bois's job as a professor at Atlanta University. He has real power and he uses it. And so one of the things that happens with Niagara, it is that this group of Black leaders is really unable to both organize nationally and is unable to get the money even to sustain itself against what historians call the Washington machine.
Yes, so this brings us to, that's 1905, and we now have a series of, there's the Brownsville Affair, which is in Texas, which is a number of, which is basically there's a African-American division in Texas, and it's blamed for a riot, and people are all arrested and I think also killed. Mm-hmm. There's then the 1906 Atlanta riot. Yes. But then there's a riot in 1908 in Springfield, Illinois, right, which is Illinois. First of all, let's just point out it's Illinois. And what happened? This riot, which we can talk about for one reason, it's one of the, it seems like the same kind of riot that happens somewhere. It's a woman who says that a Black man has accosted her. Of course, later on, he says she admits that's not true. And it leads to this massacre of Black people in Springfield. I might be summarizing it, but it seems like it follows the general the general way that these things occurred. Is that true?
That is, yes, that will be the pattern throughout the South, that lynchings of Black men in particular, but also lynching of Black women and children is very often predicated on an accusation of the rape of white women, or the perpetrators are attacking Black people who are actually successful in business and entrepreneurship, or they're attacking Black schools as an affront to white supremacy. And so all of those become reasons for these race riots, but none is more prevalent than the accusation against Black men of raping white women. And in fact, when W.E.B. Barnett, also a founder, part of the Niagara Movement, and also NAACP, and also the National Council of Negro Women, when she investigates, she actually investigates these lynchings, and it becomes one of the first things the NAACP will do as well. They find no evidence for these accusations. And in fact, what they find instead is, the killing of Black men, women, and children is the foundation. It's founded in white supremacy itself.
So,
yeah.
This riot happens in 1908, and this riot has suddenly there's a lot of white rabbis and white ministers and Black ministers, and there's a kind of a different response to this riot. I'm just wondering, perhaps because it was in Illinois, but why? And what does it lead to?
Well, this is what I think is so important about the founding of the NAACP as a interreligious, interracial organization, is that when we talk very briefly about some of the early threads, we didn't talk so much about social gospel, but in some ways
Tell us what social gospel is, really quick.
Just very quickly, social gospel really is all of the mainline Protestant denominations during this period of increased industrialization, urbanity, and the problems that it brings that I described earlier. Social gospel takes on this kind of liberal progressive view that churches themselves have an obligation to address these problems of poverty, problems of alcoholism, problems of lack of education, poor health conditions. It is part of, and so what you see is that the people who are involved in the social gospel movement, a Protestant movement, and if you want me to, I can add on some of the problems within that movement too. Social gospel, and then we also have the progressives, right? And then you have Black people who have already been organizing for this assertive move against lynching and against Washington's position. What that Springfield riot does is to bring all of those people to the same table. And what is so fascinating, and in some ways not surprising, different ones of them already know each other. So W.E.B. Barnett, right, who is investigating lynchings and lives in Chicago and has her own newspaper, knows Lillian Wald, who is a nurse and is the founder of public health in the United States, because her concern is the health of children and families and immigrants in American cities. They already know each other. And Lillian Wald knows Villard. Yeah. And so you have this kind of intertwining relationships that allows Oswald Garrison Villard, the grandson of William Lloyd Garrison, the great leader of abolitionism. It is Villard that places what historians are calling the call, literally calling in all of these people. We need to do something about this violence.
He's also the founder of the Nation magazine.
Exactly.
He also owned the New York Post at that time.
Right. The New York Evening Post, his father, right. And then he eventually becomes a writer and then the editor of the
And
New
I
York
just want to point out that Springfield, having been a reporter in Chicago for many years, this also, there's a huge movement, abolitionist movement and kind of human rights movement coming out of Chicago.
Right.
Emil Hirsch, who's the person who's influenced, the rabbi who's influenced Rosenwald to, help build the Rosenwald schools, what's known as the Rosenwald schools. That it brings together people from Chicago. I think it gets them even more involved in what's happening. But there's this call for all these leaders to come together, and they meet in New York. Right. Why New York?
Well, in part, it's Villard is there, and he really is calling. He's making the call.
He's funding a lot of this at this point, right?
Right. Okay. And they're all coming to New York. And the other thing that's really critical here is he actually does invite Booker T. Washington to come to the meeting. I don't know if you knew that.
No, I didn't know that at all. No, that's really
which is interesting. And he really doesn't like Washington at all. I mean, obviously, he is really in the anti-Washington camp. He invites Washington, assuming Washington will decline, because Washington can't risk a reputation among his own white benefactors of being with this group that includes someone like W.E.B. Du Bois or even Villard. And so he declines the invitation, and Villard is, relieved.
Quick aside there. I know we're going to go back to this meeting, but one thing that we've talked about before, which I think is really important for everyone to know, is that in retrospect, Booker T. Washington wasn't really against all these things. He just was. Just tell us for 1 minute what Booker T. Washington was really doing.
Right. And so historians who now have access, it's a good thing for people to remember, even from those days, that eventually a historian may see something you've done and written, that historians have unearthed all of the evidence that Booker T. Washington was secretly giving funds, helping to fund anti-lynching campaigns. He was also helping to fund kind of voting rights campaigns and doing it with, I think I saw a reference where and he never put his name on it, but historians have figured out that the name of the person called XYZ was actually Booker T. Washington. And he was doing this all along in great secrecy.
But here he was in the South, and here we are in New York right now. And so all these leaders come together, about 40 or 60 of them. And
right.
They basically, in 2 meetings, develop what becomes the NAACP.
Right. And they create a platform very similar to the one that I defined. The number 1 item really is lynching and then voting. And then they explicitly state that this group will support the full education of African Americans. And so there's this real jab and stab at Booker T. Washington's education platform, because they say they will support the full education of Black people, not just the industrial education. And what the other thing, though, Nadine, that I think makes, one of the obvious questions would be, why does this succeed when the Niagara Movement lasted about, really only about 4 or 5 years, began to decline in terms of the people attending, in terms of having funds to do anything? I think it is because this was, number 1, a coalition. There was nothing Washington was going to do to infiltrate the New York Evening Post or the Nation. There was no influence Washington had over a Lillian Wald or a Walding or a Morfield Story or Spingarns. He had no influence
Let's
at all.
stay right there with that. Let's step back even a little bit more. At this meeting, it's not just all Blacks. The Niagara was mostly Blacks who were meeting. This meeting in New York, or these two meetings in New York, which occur in 1909 and 1910, there are white Gentiles, there are Jews, there are Blacks. It's usually different kind of meeting, which then leads to this coalition, which you're basically explaining here, that the coalition provided safe security and
power, right? Safe security and power. And so, yeah.
Also, what about funding?
And it provides the funding. And so essentially people like Villard and especially the Spingarns provide a great deal of money to underwrite the NAACP. And then part of that power also becomes Crisis Magazine, which W.E.B. Du Bois is the editor and of the magazine for its first full generation, right? And selling of the magazine also brings in money for what ultimately becomes the litigation platform.
And it has 100,000 readers at that time, which is
exactly.
A lot of readers.
And the NAACP is not just this elite enclave, which in fact, all of the other movements had been these elite enclaves of elite Black people who were highly educated, almost all of them college educated, including the women, many of whom were Oberlin College graduates. So I'm very proud to say that. Like Mary Jane Patterson, the first Black woman in the United States to receive a bachelor's degree in 1862. She's part of this movement. Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells Barnett. So they have formed a women's organization, which still exists. And then they also join in the work for the NAACP. But it's a very elite group for all of this early organizing. But what happens with the NAACP with a membership is that membership and subscribing to Crisis Magazine is open to absolutely everyone. So and I believe I don't know if I have the exact numbers, but I believe within the first 5 or 6 years, Du Bois has something like 6,000 to 10,000 subscribers for Crisis alone. And so the NAACP has an independence, both financially in terms and also in terms of its diversity, that the other movements did not have. And there was one other contribution I was thinking of, I forgot to add.
I'll pop it and then you'll remember.
Yeah, sure.
First of all, it's organized by chapters too. There's this central group. And so that's how people become members. So that's usually important. Also, I just want to point out that they were also getting funding from Jacob Schiff, also getting some funding from Rosenwald and also from Herbert Lehman. So there was actual some of the money that was supporting Booker T. Washington also started coming into NAACP, which was important too.
Yes. Oh, the other source of money that I just remembered is all of the pro bono work that the lawyers were doing that litigated the earliest court cases for the NAACP was completely done pro bono. And that included, I wanted to give you the names of some of those lawyers for the earliest cases.
Well, there's also there was a case where, again, in Illinois, where a man was named Green I guess he killed his boss in self-defense, and then Ida B. Wells championed this. It was a huge case. And actually, the Ida B. Wells and NAACP managed to get him out of the country, and it got a huge amount of publicity, and it brought in Joel Spingarn, who became hugely important, and then later on serves as the president. And he's a wealthy Jew who's also the head of the comparative literature department at Columbia.
Right.
He eventually quits his job and just focuses on the NAACP.
Right.
And he brings in his brother, Arthur Springarn, who
Right.
is a big lawyer, and
Right.
then who also provides pro bono and brings in a lot of pro bono lawyers.
Right. And this really is the beginning of what we now know as the Legal Defense Fund, which eventually breaks off and becomes its own entity, but it's still the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, with, of course, Thurgood Marshall becoming its, the first head of the Legal Defense Fund. But all of this, none of this could have happened, these changes, and the power of the NAACP to actually make a demonstrable difference. And in fact, here's another interesting piece I just saw for the first time yesterday. It was Jane Addams of Hull House, who was also part of this movement. It was Jane Addams who suggested that given the enormity of the agenda that the NAACP had taken on to change the template of racial violence, to garner the right to vote for the universal suffrage for Black men and women, and to provide education for Black people as a nationwide agenda. It was Addams who said, only take on litigation that creates a precedence for the rest of the nation. Because at first, what the NAACP did, and with all of these lawyers who were doing work for free, simply said, send us your cases. And they got hundreds of requests from Black people to take on their cases, which was impossible to do, of course. And so they selected cases based upon intentionally taking cases to the Supreme Court in order to establish a national legal precedent that would then impact the rest of the country.
And that goes on to today. And, Justice Ginsburg did that with all the cases that she chose. And still now all sides are doing that. They're strategically choosing cases. So that's a really interesting thing that came out of NAACP. Also, Jane Addams is really interesting. I didn't realize she was also the person who suggested that they make their original proclamation about what they were doing on Lincoln's birthday.
Yes.
And I had no idea until also yesterday I was reading that it's because her father, John Adams, was a state legislator in Springfield with Abraham Lincoln, and I had never put that together. So there were so many connections.
Well, the Lord and all of them use, I recall now Henry Walling, who was another leader at that very first meeting, had been the secretary for Senator Sumter. And so these kind of lines from abolition through Civil War Reconstruction going to what is essentially now a second and third generation, right? And that's following in the footsteps of the Black and white abolitionists, I think is very important in terms of telling us about legacy and continuity for ourselves in our own time.
That's a great point. Well, I just want to take a pause to talk about some of the people who were the founders. So, there's Henry Moskowitz, who is a social worker, he's a Jewish leader. He's one of the people who, really involved. There's Emil Hirsch in Chicago. I'm just mentioning some of the Jews here. There's Lillian Wald, who is in the book I did with Justice Ginsburg, who you've already mentioned.
Yes.
There are, and then there's some huge, major, towering Black figures like Ida B. Wells, who, by the way, I went to see. I went to Holly Springs, Mississippi, 2 years ago to go to her home. And then there's also W.E. Du Bois. There were a lot of powerful people here. Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about coalition building, how did the NAACP manage to deal with all these people? I mean, these leaders, the people who came together, these are people with big egos, major careers. How coalitions fall apart every day on this kind of problem. how did the NAACP manage to keep them all together, or sort of?
Sort of, kind of with difficulty. And that it also meant that within that coalition building and the, let's say, large personalities that were in the room, that some people, in fact, were excluded. And so someone like, Ida B. Wells Barnett, that was just so uncompromising, actually was, after that founding meeting, she was not included among that executive committee. And in fact, Du Bois himself has a reputation at the time, not only at this meeting, but even among his Black colleagues. Du Bois has a reputation for being very difficult to deal with, but Villard just idolized Du Bois. And so Du Bois had, and I think they felt they needed Du Bois as the foundation of this anti-Washington position. Du Bois had written a book in 1903. Some people may be familiar with The Souls of Black Folk, where an entire chapter is on Booker T. Washington and his philosophy of education and what it did to undermine the freedom of Black people.
Because he really believed that you have to have this tenth of the, he's a sociologist.
Yes.
And you have to have the elite to help, make the change. And go ahead. Yep.
Right. And the educational system of Black schools is what's going to create and foster this talented 10th. And even in saying that, I mean, part of what is also going on among Black organizers at this time, as I said earlier, they are very much an elite group. This is not the mass movement that we will see later. If anything, it's Marcus Garvey in the 1920s that will really create a mass organization, much larger actually than the NAACP. But these smaller groups are highly elitist. There's a bit of noblesse oblige within the Black community itself, of a notion of uplift of the Black masses that these Black elites have as well. It is the actual motto of the women's club movement, is lifting as we climb, which fits directly into and seamlessly into Du Bois's idea of a talented 10th. And so that accusation of kind of elitism is valid and real. But I do think that the litigation approach to violence and lynching and to getting Black people the right to vote, as we know today, is very effective, even though it's a very slow process to work through the courts.
I want to ask in a minute, we're running, I want to have some time for questions, and there's a lot of questions, but let me just pause for a second to say what's happening in the Jewish community at that time.
Sure.
We talked a lot about the Black community. And, in the 1900s, there's a whole nationalist movement, and there's more elections, and this ends up leading to the development of political parties. And a number of those political parties use anti-Semitism to get votes. So you have a whole new level of kind of political anti-Semitism that's developing. And this also in 1903, 1905, very, very important, is the beginning of somebody that, but we don't know really which year it is, but the protocols of the Elders of Zion are published in Russia. Then in 1900 in the United States, suddenly more than 40% of Jews are newcomers with 10 years or less in the country. And then between 1910 and 1924, another 1.75 million come. Of these is like they're coming from, many of them are coming for economic reasons, but many of them are coming because they've survived or watched pogroms. And one of them is one of my grandmas, who comes at 1908 after her parents were killed in a pogrom. So, there's a lot of anti-Semitism at this particular time And I think it's an interesting period for us to be looking at. So even the Jews that were here, like the German Jews who had come in 1848, in the mid-19th century, Sephardic Jews who had come even earlier, there was suddenly a whole new way of looking at Jews in the United States, and it wasn't a positive way. And so some of these Jews who were very involved in, supporting movements, social movements, were very aware of anti-Semitism. And I think it's really important also to mention that first of all, there was, Jews were being restricted residentially. Jews couldn't live places, they couldn't join the clubs, they couldn't get jobs. It was the beginning of quotas beginning to be discussed. There was the whole international garments, there were all these workers, there was the Triangle Fire in 1911. And I just want to end with one thing that's really important. In 1913 is the founding of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League. It actually starts in Chicago. It becomes part of B'nai B'rith, but somebody named Sigmund Livingston goes to a play and he sees the horrible caricatures of Jews in the play, and he walks out and he decides he has to do something. So this is, there's a lot going on in the Jewish community at the same time as there's going on in the Black community.
Yeah,
So,
and in some ways there's a parallel story. It isn't the same story, but it's a parallel story at the same time of an entire national enterprise that I referenced before in terms of social Darwinism. But as we also know, as immigrants come into Ellis Island, there's this whole science of phrenology, of being able to tell who people are and who the criminal types by how they look and their, the measuring of their head and how close their eyes are, et cetera. So this kind of racism around ethnicity, nationality, and then there's discriminatory laws that come out of that is part of this period for Jews, for Italians, for Black people. And then it becomes concretized in the reorganization of the Ku Klux Klan that happens right after the showing the film Birth of a Nation. And sometimes people forget the anti-Semitism and anti-Catholicism, anti-immigrant platform of a Ku Klux Klan.
and how they're so deeply connected.
Exactly.
Yes. So there's a whole we're not going to even get to all the conversation about what the NAACP managed to accomplish. It takes them a while. We'll have to have a part 2 of this, and then how, what they do, what the NAACP, manages to achieve in the 1960s. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the Black Jewish Coalition today. I think it's very important that there's so many different, one of the ideas behind this whole Wide River conversation, there's so many channels of Black Jewish relationships over the years. But there has been times where parts of the community have worked together very successfully and built a larger coalition, and a coalition that was beyond the elites. And this is a really important, and I really believe that the Black and Jewish coalition are part of the kind of building blocks of our democracy as we know it today. So what can we learn from, we have to skip so much, but what can we learn from the coalition building around the NAACP that would be valuable for us to know today?
Several things. Number one is, I think part of the problem, Nadine, is people really have no clue about this history, right? And so there is no kind of legacy, a foundation on which one can then have the conversation about now as we are doing in this space. So I think that the learning that we're doing, and as I said, I'm learning from you also, right? That actually is not occurring in most spaces. And I would encourage civic groups, synagogues, churches, libraries, museums, magazines, et cetera, to be engaged in this work of telling the story. That's number one. Number two, I think that the there are also opportunities for us to see ways in which all of our humanity is elevated by the validation of the humanity in each other. Because anti-Semitism is still with us. It is not as if this is just a historical issue. And so when Jews are attacked and killed, when synagogues and Jewish cemeteries are desecrated, when there is hate speech, hate language, one of the things that this period and even abolitionism itself should teach us is that I stand up for your rights because they are mine. And that if I don't, then I have actually diminished myself, and the reverse is also true. I think we also have to look for spaces where those coalitions are still occurring in viable ways. And for example, there are movements now among most of the mainline Protestant churches to confront their own internal racism. We all know that institutions of higher learning are, especially, the Ivy League and state universities, I know Rutgers is doing this, is looking at their own history of being complicit in the slave trade, in enslavement, in the subjugating of Native peoples. There is obviously churches are now looking at their complicity in literally kidnapping Native American children and taking them from their families. I mean, the historical record is one that is terribly rife with people who claim to be doing good, but are, destructive of human life. I think that is a common story for all of us, and that there's work to be done here and now. The violence is still here against Jews, against Black people, against Asian American Pacific Islanders, against LGBTQ people. I mean, the violence one would hope no longer with impunity, right, as it was in the past, is also still with us. But there is something that triggers in our society someone's idea that to walk into a Black church and kill people at prayer is not aberrant, but that it actually is condoned by society, that something is happening, that we are messaging to young men in particular, but the nation in general, that these actions of violence and hatred are acceptable. Yeah. That is a job for all of us to take on, because we all become the victims, right, of that kind of psychology of violence and racism, anti-Semitism, et cetera.
And we can't allow ourselves to be divided. And one lesson also is that interfaith and interracial, intergender coalitions are incredibly important. I feel like it's something that we forget. We all get so divided. We have identity. We have to be careful about making our identities too small.
Yes. But recognizing that creating those coalitions is really hard.
Yes.
It is very hard work, because our experiences and histories are not the same. Yes. And the big warning I always give is that we also don't compare human pain and inhumanity, that one person suffering from being debased and dehumanized is too many. And so it isn't that one struggle is more of a struggle or more important than the other, but that everybody's struggle, everybody owns everyone else's struggle, right? And that is the challenge, though, for building coalitions, which are really challenging and hard to do.
Well, I think we have to end on this point, because with so much more to talk about, I wanted to hand it over to Suzanne a little bit so that she can fit in a few of the many, many questions that put in the chat.
Thank you both, and especially Dr. Edwards, for this fabulous, fabulous conversation. There are a lot of questions, so I'm sorry to everybody that we're not going to get to everything. I'm going to try to combine a few. One person wanted to know, even though Frederick Douglass died in 1895, what were his thoughts of Booker T. Washington? And somebody else asked, someone in the next century, did Elaine Locke, was he involved? And you may want to explain who he is for those who are not familiar.
Yes, Elaine Locke was a member of the NAACP. He really is considered to be more a part of that second generation starting in the 1920s to 1930s. He worked with Ida B. Wells Barnett in investigating lynchings because he had such straight, light hair and fair skin that he actually could pass in a white crowd. And so he is pivotal in those investigations. And he also is one of the people who's considered to be almost a founder of the Harlem Renaissance and an advocate of the Black arts in the 1920s. So he was very much active as not as a founder of the NAACP, but more in the late 19-teens. The other question was about
Frederick Douglass's views.
Yes. So in terms of Douglass's death, Douglass was a part of this earlier organizing in post-reconstruction of the Negro Congress and other organizations that really were more 1880s, late 1870s and 1880s, that tried to do this national organizing as kind of Black liberty after the Civil War was being shut down. As you all may know, Douglass throughout his life was an ardent supporter of women's suffrage and continued to be that, to advocate for that throughout his life. He would not have been a voice and still alive during this period of the Washington machine, which really comes after that Atlantic Exposition speech. So, Washington becomes president of Tuskegee 1881. It really is only after that speech that he has this, it's 20 years of prominence as the, most powerful Black person in America.
Thank you. Somebody had a question about the lynchings. Aside from the case where Leo Frank, a white Jewish man, was lynched after being convicted of murdering a 13-year-old, were there other lynchings that did not involve the Black community?
Oh, yes. There were, I don't have all of the details of the numbers, which you can probably find with the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, and on their website will give you those details. But Italians and other Eastern and Southern Europeans were lynched in particular, and Jews in particular were lynched in addition to African Americans.
Thank you. I'm going to ask two different questions. Was there a sense that the white and Jewish allies were paternalistic, or did they yield to the leadership of the Blacks when creating the NAACP? And somebody else said that they understand initially the lawyers for the NAACP were Jewish, but later they were replaced by some Black lawyers. And they were curious why that happened if the NAACP was founded by different people, including Jews.
Right. I believe, in fact, there's a statement from, I believe it's Lillian Wald, and I was looking for the quote in my notes, but I can't find it. If I find it later, I'll give it to you. But Lillian Wald actually says after that very first meeting of the call that she had come there thinking that she and others were helping Black people. And she realized from that meeting that, in fact, Black people had their own voice and commanded their own stage for their own movement and their own needs. It was just really, I'm paraphrasing here, but it was very, very powerful statement. My guess is that some of those participants assumed that they were, helping the poor Black people, but that could not have been the case if you're in a room with Ida B. Wells Barnett that didn't hold back from absolutely anyone, including the Black men in the room. That definitely was not true for W.E.B. Du Bois. And other people who became involved, also Harvard graduate, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who's the kind of father of Black history, also became involved in the movement. And so these were powerful Black people who are accustomed to being in charge. Bishops of the AME Church, AME Zion Church, Baptist Church, who were also accustomed to being in charge. And we have to remember, all of these people have been organizing before they come to the call that creates the NAACP. And so my guess, given the racial landscape of America, is some of those white participants assumed this kind of paternalistic position of helping Black people, that they would have been very quickly made aware that that was not their position.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We're going to try to get to a few more if people don't mind hanging on. Someone is curious, how do the respective viewpoints of Du Bois and Washington impact current perspectives in the African-American community in the 21st century?
Oh, that's a really interesting one, because one of the things about Du Bois, because he lived so long to age 95, Du Bois actually shifts his own philosophy of education and its philosophy of politics to move more and more toward understanding that that there has to be an economic agenda, which is in fact what Booker T. Washington, as well as Marcus Garvey, promoted, and Du Bois didn't like either one of them. And so the idea that it's not very different from Martin Luther King shifting to that Poor People's Campaign and understanding the centrality of economics to Black freedom and citizenship. And so I think the lesson that we can learn today from this kind of bifurcated view, and especially given our current technological economy that has left poor and poor people and people of color and women outside of the economic advantages of that technological system, is that all doors of opportunity have to be open. And that includes, the kid who wants to do coding. That includes the person who wants to go to the, very expensive small liberal arts college or Ivy League or R1 state university. And that is that the opportunity structures need to be equally accessible to everyone. And we know that, for example, higher education isn't just because it costs so much. We know that technological opportunity really is race, gender based and class based of who has access to technological change. Even having high-speed Wi-Fi during COVID was an issue for, a fifth grader. And so we know that that structural inequality that Du Bois saw still exists, and that what Booker T. Washington was talking about primarily was job opportunity. I mean, when you kind of break down what he's really talking about, can Black people get jobs? And that question is still with us. So I think both of their agendas are still require our work and attention.
Thank you. And as we start to wrap up, can you please talk about the NAACP today? Where does it stand in all the organizations that are out there? And have they come out against anti-Semitism? There has, I guess there was a case in Philadelphia where the head of the NAACP made some anti-Semitic statements. So kind of where are things today?
Yeah, I think in terms of the salience of the movement, I think the power of the NAACP has been that it has been able to morph and change, and that its primary agenda of litigation, which now sits in the Legal Defense Fund, has been broadened to include everything from a public health agenda for Black people, which was really not on the table, even a couple of generations ago, to be able to look at the current landscape and see a new list of problems has been necessary for it to survive, and I believe it is still relevant. I am not sure what the leadership of the NAACP has said about anti-Semitism within its own ranks. What it should do is to be kind of brutally honest in calling it anti-Semitism and rejecting it from its own organization, and using its own principles and beliefs to do so. To do otherwise undermines the NAACP itself. I am not surprised, though, that those things will happen. One of the things we know is if we live in a nation that has certain kinds of social and cultural norms, there is no one that's immune to them. There is no one immune to the anti-Semitism that is part of the fabric of the nation, not only historically, but current anti-Semitism. So it's not surprising to me that you'll hear statements which are anti-Semitic or actions that are anti-Semitic coming from Black people who are part of the larger landscape of the nation. But it would be the role of NAACP leadership in particular to come down really hard in rejecting anything that dehumanizes anyone, including Jewish people.
Thank you. And finally, a note about young people, both young people in the Black community, young people in the Jewish community, who really don't know much about the history of the two communities forging partnerships and working together. Suggestions on how we reach both groups to kind of start dialogue again between them.
One of the things I've brought up with my friends and peers who actually teach and work in Holocaust and genocide studies is I don't think anti-Semitism is actually taught in American schools. I think anti-Semitism is viewed as something that occurred in Nazi Germany. And it doesn't mean, obviously, the Holocaust needs to be and must be taught. But that larger landscape of anti-Semitism in America is missing. And so there isn't a national consciousness, nor are children taught as they're looking at the larger landscape of American history, that Jews were dehumanized in the kind of caricatures of Jews in popular culture and performances, the caricatures in newspapers of Jews as vermin coming off of ships, and that kind of dehumanization and debasement isn't taught. And so I think most kids are completely unaware and would take the attacks in synagogues as a kind of one-off, that somehow it's odd and unusual, when in fact it is not. It's part of a longer history. I think the history of coalitions is also missing. When I talk to audiences and even say the NAACP is a progressive era organization, there is no connection in people's minds that it's connected to Jane Addams and Hull House and settlement houses in Detroit, and it's connected to muckrakers and antitrust, and that the NAACP is part of that whole mix. Because it is framed as being a solely Black organization. And in some ways then to frame its history as coalition repositions it as an American institution, right? We should see the NAACP as kind of almost archetypical, an archetype of American possibility and American hope. That such coalitions are possible, that there are people who can have common ground in understanding the true meaning of democracy is that freedom is, in fact, guaranteed for all. And that is what the NAACP does. I'll end on that hopeful note.
Yes, great. Thank you. Well, again, thank you, Nadine. Thank you, Dr. Edwards. We really appreciate you taking the time with us yet again. I will be sending out an email with a link to the recording to this program, and I will also include the link to the program we did with Dr. Edwards about historically Black colleges and universities, as well as all of the programs that we've done under the Wide River Project, which we have been working with. I know somebody asked about Eric Ward. He's been very involved in our project as well, and has been the speaker for many of our programs. So again, thank you both. Thank you all for joining us. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to more questions. It's a big topic, and please stay tuned. We'll have more programs scheduled in the future. All right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.